seeing. Basically, a seeing is a relationship between two events in the gossip graph, and it almost boils down to one event being an ancestor of another event. So basically, we have those parents in every gossip event, so a parent of an event, or a parent of a parent, or a parent of a parent, etc. You get the idea. We refer to them as ancestors. So every event that is an ancestor of another event, well, one event sees another event if the other event is its ancestor, almost. But there is one caveat. So, but let us see some examples. Yeah, I was talking about this. So in this example, we can see that A1 sees C0 because basically C0 is the other parent of A1, so it is its ancestor. So A1 sees it. It doesn't have to be direct. It may be indirect, like in this example. I'm not sure if it's visible that well, but it's the path from B0 to B1 and from B1 to C2. So basically, this means that C2 sees B0 because B0 is a parent of its parent, so again, an ancestor. The only case when this definition doesn't work, the only exception to this rule, is in the presence of forks. So I mentioned earlier that, and we see in this graph, that every member of the network constructs its own linear history of events. But one of the members could decide to be malicious and create a fork. A fork is basically just creating two different events with the same self-parent. So, for example, it could look like this. Like this. So, in this example, Carol created two events that both have her event as a self-parent. Those events we call C1 and C1 prime. And then she gossiped one of them to Dave. She built another event on top of the second one and again gossiped it to Dave, which wasn't a very smart move because Dave instantly learns about her fork. But yeah, basically now how seeing works in such a case. Until we are aware of the fork, nothing changes. Basically, for example, C1 prime is still an ancestor of D1, so we can say that D1 sees C1 and everything is fine. But once we learn of the fork, the rules change a bit. So Dave learns of the fork at D2. So once he creates D2, it sees neither C1 nor C1 prime, because this D2 has ancestors on two different branches of the fork. And at this point, we say that this event sees neither one of them. So whenever there is a fork involved, we stop seeing anything that is on this fork, which has important consequences in dealing with malicious actions like this one. Okay, so related to the next concept is another notion I will introduce, a notion of a supermajority. Well, usually you keep hearing about majorities, so more than a half of members of something are a majority, but here half is not enough. We need a supermajority, which is defined as more than 2/3 of the members of the network. Why more than 2/3? It guarantees two nice features. First, every supermajority will always have a majority of the honest nodes. Oh, because I think we haven't mentioned it before, but we function under the assumption that we will never have more than a third or more malicious nodes in a section. This is actually a theoretical limit for Byzantine fault-tolerant algorithms, so it's not that bad as it may sound. It's actually very good. But yeah, so if we have at least more than 2/3 of honest nodes, then every 2/3 of the whole network will be guaranteed to contain a majority of them. And also another nice property, yeah, so this is the first one, and another nice property is that two different supermajorities will always have an honest node in common, which will be very important in a moment. So yeah, another concept related to both seeing and supermajorities is the concept of strongly seeing. So what is strongly seeing? Basically, let's see an example. Strongly seeing adds another layer of indirection. So if we have two events, X and Y, we can say that X strongly sees Y whenever it sees events created by a supermajority of nodes that all see Y. So it can be also formulated equivalently as there existing paths in the graph that pass through events created by a supermajority of nodes. What this means? Well, here's an example. We consider A1 and B0, and actually A1 strongly sees B0. Why? Because A1 can see, well, either itself or A0, that's an event created by Alice, it can see B0, that's an event created by Bob, and it can see C0, that is event created by Carol, and all three of those events can see B0, which basically means that there is a supermajority, 3 out of 4 is a supermajority, that A1 sees, and that all see B0, which means that A1 strongly sees B0. So, for example, in D1 strongly sees A0. Why? Because it sees D1, C2, B1, and A0, all of which see A0. So this is, again, 4 out of 4, a supermajority, it strongly sees A0. And another example, A2 doesn't strongly see A0. Why? Because the only events that A2 sees, which see A0, belong to either Alice or Bob. And unfortunately, 2 out of 4 is not a supermajority, so we don't have events created by a supermajority of members that would see A0. So, no. So in this case, we don't have strongly seeing. Why is this important? There is a very, very nice property of strongly seeing, which basically allows us to do very nice things. So I formulated it like that. If event X strongly sees event Y, then no other event in the graph, and not just created by event X's creator, no other other event in the graph, can strongly see any event created by Y's creator that would be on another fork. Which basically means that if a node forks, like Carol, for example, created C1 and C1 prime, if we have an event in the graph that strongly sees C1, then we have a guarantee that no other event will strongly see C1 prime. And we can actually prove that very quickly. So basically, let's assume that it's not true. Let's assume that we have 2 different events. So for example, we have an event by Alice that strongly sees C1, and an event by Bob that would strongly see C1 prime. So let's assume that for a while. And what this means is that both an event by Alice and an event by Bob see a supermajority of events. And this supermajority of events sees, for the case of Alice, it sees C1, and for the case of Bob, it sees C1 prime. But since those 2 are supermajorities, they must have an honest node in common. So there has been an honest node that created an event that sees C1, and it also created an event that sees C1 prime. So let's say this was Dave, and that those events in question were D3 and D4, for example. So D3 sees C1 and D4 sees C1 prime. But since it has an honest node, then either D3 is an ancestor of D4 or the other way around. So let's assume that D3 is an ancestor of D4. So D3 sees C1. I don't know if you can imagine it. We didn't prepare a slide for it, unfortunately. But let's say we have this D3 event and it sees C1. Yeah? And then we have D4 and it somehow sees C1 prime. But since we have a relationship between them as well, because D3 is an ancestor, this would mean that C1 is an ancestor of D3, but also indirectly of D4. Which means that D4 has both C1 and C1 prime as ancestors, which according to the definition of seeing means that it doesn't see either one of them, which is a contradiction because we just assumed that it should have seen C1 prime, which basically proves this property. So yeah, the next thing is about interesting events, but I will leave that to Pierre.